Believe it or not, I was once young, and as a young man, I dreamed of coming to Europe. It sounded, Europe did, like a much more sophisticated place than where I grew up, out in the middle of the Arizona desert, but I figured I would never be able to visit. My college dropout slash barista salary didn't allow for a lot of lifestyle indulgences. Then, when I was 21, my dad sold his house and wanted to use some of the extra money to visit Europe. He invited me to come along as a traveling companion, and I accepted. So, in the summer of 2004, we flew to Paris, stayed in the 17th arrondissement, and then used Eurail passes to travel on to several other cities: Lyon, Montpellier, Barcelona, Valencia, Madrid. Young Mr. Chorizo didn't know it, but his life was about to change, because a few weeks later he was back home, and things began to fall apart completely. Soon he, or more first personally, I, decided that rather than continuing to participate in that desert train wreck any longer, he, or I, could scrape together the money to get one more plane ticket to Europe. There, perhaps, he/I could live briefly and intensely, and die poetically, like the great artists of yesteryear. I counted my dollars. The plan could work, as long as I didn't care about coming back. And I didn't. Such was the state of mind of your narrator the first time he went to Europe, now more than 20 years ago. Things are different these days. Mr. Chorizo, who I will henceforth be speaking about mostly in the first person, now lives in Europe full-time. I even have a European citizenship. My Spanishness is legally recognized and gives me the right to live anywhere in the entire EU. The whole thing is quite sophisticated. I'm practically a local. My wife Morena had been wanting to go to Paris for some time because of the romance. And finally, feeling a bit romantic myself these warm spring days, I agreed to take her. And so 22 years later, I ended up back in the 17th arrondissement in a much better state of mind. Not only that, but I now have a lot more worldly knowledge and context about what I'm seeing, plus access to Wikipedia. What follows is a series of observations about Paris, the city of light, the city of love, the capital of France, and perhaps of all Western civilization. Maybe call this one Random Thoughts, Paris Edition. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. We're at the tail end of the first heat wave of summer here in Spain. It's been pretty bad in a lot of parts. Here in Barcelona, it's hot, but it's not too bad. Anyway, I thought I would take an hour this afternoon to record this episode of the podcast about Paris. Usually when I travel places outside of Spain, I don't make podcast episodes about it, but this one has a couple of interesting Spanish tie-ins. So I figure it's worth doing as a regular episode. Shout out to our supporters this week. We've got JR. JR has donated multiple times. He's a multi-donor. JR is out in Texas, and he sent me a message saying, "Some support the arts, others the homeless. I support the sarcasm. LOL, really appreciate all you do, buddy. You make me laugh and think." So thank you, JR. JR was responding to my recent episode called Barcelona's Hidden Gems, where I talk about some of the tired travel writing cliches. Thank you also to Ed. Ed has a recurring subscription donation, so his support is automatic once a month. Therefore, both JR and Ed are multi-donors. Thank you very much to both. If you would like to donate, just head by expatmadrid.com/donate. expatmadrid.com/donate. That is the donation page. It'll let you choose an amount, anything from €10 on up. You could also choose to give a monthly amount, which will just be debited automatically from your card once a month. Whatever works for you, I appreciate it. It helps me to spend more time doing this which apparently is something that is useful to a lot of people out there. JR, for example, says that he has listened to every episode of this podcast, which I think is a bit extreme, but thank you very much to anyone who's willing to go through 150 episodes, almost. My first episodes, I was very tired and I was speaking much more slowly. Anyway, send your support at expatmadrid.com/donate. expatmadrid.com/donate is the donation page. I appreciate it. Let's get back to Paris, the city of love. First up, we've got Arc de Triomphe and the Peninsular Wars. Barcelona has an Arc de Triomphe. It's an impressive bit of modernist architecture, but it doesn't celebrate any specific triumph. Paris's Arc de Triomphe is supported by 4 huge columns, each of which celebrates a different series of victories by the French military. The column that I can read from where I'm standing has a long list of Spanish cities on it, or more accurately, a long list of French spellings of Spanish cities. There's La Coruña and Valence and Zaragoza. That's A Coruña, Valencia, and Zaragoza, respectively, along with several others, including the Catalan cities of Vic and Lérida. This was all part of Napoleon's occupation of Spain, which lasted from 1808 to 1814. A listener asked me a few months ago if there's any noticeable anti-French sentiment here in Spain. I said no. Some people might consider the French a bit annoying, but I've never gathered that there's any long-standing resentment about the Peninsular Wars. In fact, this is the first time I'm hearing about the Battle of Vic. I've been to Vic several times. It's about an hour and a half by train from Barcelona. There's no huge monument to the struggle against Napoleon. And generally, people aren't talking about things that happened in 1810 anyway. The Battle of Vic pitted a Spanish force under General O'Donnell against a French army out on the plain in central Catalonia. The French cavalry overwhelmed the Spanish who fled. O'Donnell, of Irish descent, was the uncle of the more famous Leopoldo O'Donnell, who led a coup later in 1856, installing himself as president. There's a street in Madrid called O'Donnell. I believe it's named after Leopoldo, the more famous of the two. Also, according to Wikipedia, the city of Lleida, or Lérida, has been under siege at least 9 times in its recorded history. The 1810 siege lasted about 2 weeks and ended in a defeat for the locals. That's why it's on the list of French triumphs. If you want to know more about all this, look at the article on Wikipedia called Peninsular War. But like I said, almost nobody is talking about this. In the community of Madrid, the city and the region of Madrid, there's a holiday on May 2nd that celebrates an uprising against Napoleon, and they do a couple of little battles where guys in costume from that period pretend to fight each other. The holiday is 2 de Mayo, and if you go to Plaza 2 de Mayo on that day, you will see this happening. Afterwards, there was a coalition of countries trying to get Napoleon out of Spain, so the British sent the Duke of Wellington down here. I don't think he was the Duke of Wellington at the time, but occasionally you'll see a street named Wellington or a monument to Wellington somewhere, and that's probably why. Moving on, let's talk about the Louvre and Parisian architecture. Before we go any further, let me apologize. I will be trying to pronounce some things in French here. I don't actually speak French, but I kind of understand it as another European language. Anyway, I am hereby apologizing for my mix of English, Spanish, and French. If some of the things I pronounce in French, I'm actually pronouncing a Spanglicized version of French pronunciation or something along those lines, I also apologize for that. I can't decide if I should say Louvre, Louvre, or if I should attempt an actual French pronunciation with something like Louvre. Just please bear with me. I'm a guy from the Arizona desert and I'm trying to do the best I can. Either way, the taxi driver gets us to the Louvre 5 minutes before the time on our ticket. It costs us an arm and a leg because of the Free Now app's variable pricing. But apparently, flagging down a taxi at rush hour on a Friday isn't some easy task. The architecture along the way to the museum is awe-inspiring. It's hard for me to imagine anybody at any time caring this much about their city. But I guess none of this was done democratically or achieved by committee. If Louis XVI or Napoleon wanted to build a huge monument to his own ego, he could just make it happen. Who's going to say no to an absolute monarch? In a republic like the US, the courts can stop the president from building a ballroom. Do we really need all this decoration at the White House? How much taxpayer money are we spending on gold leaf exactly? So we go on vacation to marvel at the elaborate architecture elsewhere and wonder why we can't have this back home. Inside the Louvre, we follow the signs towards the Mona Lisa, then towards Venus de Milo. What makes those two works more important than anything else here, I couldn't tell you. I enjoy the paintings of the Virgin Mary quite a bit these days, and the Jacques-Louis David painting Leonidas at Thermopylae is quite striking as well, despite all the male nudity, or perhaps because of it. But the painting that sticks with me the most this time is the Coronation of Napoleon, also by Jacques-Louis David, which shows the scene inside Notre Dame on the day Napoleon was crowned. As Pope Pius VII and others look on, Josephine kneels and Napoleon holds up the crown. Apparently, he's about to place the crown on Josephine's head, but the original concept was that Napoleon was to be painted crowning himself, which in fact he did. The Pope handed him the crown and he put it on his own head. You can Google these paintings. Jacques-Louis David is the name of the artist, but if you're at the Louvre in Paris, you can see them. They're absolutely huge. The next morning, I'm up early for the 8:30 a.m. Mass at Notre Dame Cathedral. Actually, I'm up a couple of hours early, so I catch the metro towards the center and then walk the rest of the way, looking for coffee. Nothing seems to be open at this time, but eventually I find a churro and hot dog stand with a Lebanese guy who makes me an espresso allongé in a tiny paper cup. After that, I walk into the cathedral. There's a black priest giving a speech around the baptismal font near the entry. It's all in French, which I barely understand, but the priest is young and he's got a lot of charisma. After a few minutes, he leads everyone back to sit down near the altar. Mass being approximately the same in every Catholic church, I'm able to understand some of it. The Mea culpa has a couple of familiar lines. Je confesse à Dieu Tout-Puissant que j'ai beaucoup péché, par pensée, par parole et par action. I told you I was going to be attempting some French. The Lord's Prayer also has some parts that I can understand. Donnez-nous aujourd'hui notre pain de ce jour. Pardonne-nous nos offenses et ne nous laissez pas entrer en tentation, mais délivrez-nous del mal. After Mass, I take the tour around the cathedral. It looks great after the 2019 fire and subsequent repairs, but you can still see some scaffolding here and there. Behind the altar, there's a giant gold sunburst that contains Jesus' crown of thorns and a piece of the true cross. The crown was acquired by King Louis IX in 1239. The thorns were all broken off over the years and distributed as gifts. Nearby Sainte-Chapelle costs some money to get in, but I go with Morena later that morning. It's all stained glass on the inside and truly spectacular. The restaurants in Paris have a definite aesthetic. Colorful interiors, upholstered chairs and booths, lots of mirrors, tiny round tables crammed together outside on the sidewalk. A waitress near Notre Dame serves me a tiny cup of coffee next to a tiny glass of water after Mass. I guess that Americans coming to Europe for the first time find this vaguely ridiculous. Everything is smaller in France. Then there's the food. My main concern, food-wise, is getting enough protein at every meal, so if you take me to a French restaurant, I'm probably ordering the steak. Unfortunately, all the steaks are very small, about the size of my palm. I try to fill up on freedom fries, salad, and bread, and end up just feeling sluggish. Morena is a bit disappointed as well. Although to be fair, the ingredients are high quality and things basically taste good. It's like a slightly better version of Spanish food, but more expensive and served in smaller portions. Underwhelming most of the time. Elsewhere, we have a bad South Indian dinner and a good meal of Chinese noodles at La Taverne de Joan, but that's not really typical French cuisine. The best French meal we have is at Prout Prout, which apparently means something like hoity-toity. I would recommend the tuna croquettes, but I also get the idea it's a place where the menu changes frequently. The culinary highlight for both of us was an impulse buy, pâté en croûte, that I got at a little charcuterie. That's a bit of liver and fatty meats baked into a pie crust with a layer of beef gelatin on top. It's a lot better than it sounds or looks. On Saturday afternoon, Morena goes to meet up with a friend who now lives here in Paris. I head off to see some famous graves. When I was a teenager, it was well known that Jim Morrison's grave was here in Paris, and that American tourists would come to leave gifts in front of his tombstone. But Morrison died 55 years ago in 1971, and his most ardent fans are probably in their 70s these days. I don't know if his grave is still attracting pilgrims. Anyway, that cemetery is about an hour away by metro. Instead, I end up at the cemetery of Montmartre, where I wander between stone monuments to people I've never heard of. There's Louise Weber, known as La Golou, who worked on the development of the can-can dance. Once called the Queen of Montmartre, she performed at the nearby Moulin Rouge. She was quite famous in her day, but she ended her life alcoholic and destitute, selling peanuts on a Montmartre street corner. There's Alexander Dumas-Fils, the son of the author of The Count of Monte Cristo. He, the son, was also a novelist, but not nearly as famous as his father. There's Michel Foucault, the physicist and inventor of the pendulum that's hanging across town at the Pantheon. And François Truffaut, the filmmaker and pioneer of French New Wave cinema. All that information I just got from Wikipedia. I may recognize names like Foucault or Truffaut, but I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about them. Finally, I find the grave of the only name I can attach some biographical data to, Edgar Degas. The tomb just has the name of the Famille Degas and a little portrait of Edgar with a signature under it, rendered in bronze. The only problem is, when I look up Degas later on, I realize I wasn't thinking about Degas at all. Edgar Degas painted young girls dancing. I've seen one of his famous paintings at the Met Gallery. But on this journey to find his grave, I was thinking of a surrealist painter, maybe Kandinsky. I Google Vasily Kandinsky to find out. Nope, not him either. Eventually, I realized that the picture I have in my head and wrongly associated with Edgar Degas is I and the Village by Marc Chagall. Well, that's enough high culture for today. Sorry Degas, sorry Chagall and Kandinsky. I have some final thoughts here about Napoleon and Joan of Arc. Years ago, I read that crazy people in the 19th century often thought they were Napoleon. Not literally, I assume, but grandiose narcissists in those days might imagine themselves to be great men of history, above the law and common conceptions of morality. Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment is an example. He's a great admirer of Napoleon who decides he is free to invent his own version of right and wrong. When he kills two women with an axe in a sordid scene, he's feeding his inflated self-image. He thinks he's a superior being. The point of the article about people imagining themselves to be Napoleon was that different times create different sorts of crazy people. Which brings us to Joan of Arc. Plenty of people hear voices, not all of them benevolent. Joan of Arc, around age 14, started hearing voices that identified themselves as Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, and they were telling her to go to Charles VII and announce that she was the liberator of France. The future king believed her, oddly enough. I suppose in those days, young people having visions wasn't completely out of the ordinary. And so Charles sent her to the siege of Orléans, where she rallied the troops. Apparently it worked. A few days after she arrived, the English abandoned the siege, and the city was saved. After that, Joan became a valued military advisor. All this was during the 100 Years' War, which incidentally lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. Everything was fine for a bit until she was captured by the English. The English thought she was possessed by the devil and put her on trial for heresy. Among the charges were wearing men's clothes and having demonic visions. She was burnt at the stake around age 20 in 1431. A later retrial found that she wasn't a heretic, and she was later canonized and made patron saint of France in 1920. But by then she had been dead for a long time. After he crowned himself emperor in 1804, Napoleon began transforming Paris into an imperial capital, intended to rival ancient Rome in its grandeur. And it worked. Walking around the center of Paris on either side of the Seine, I'm struck that this must be, in some sense, the capital of Western civilization. What Napoleon would think about France in the 21st century, or about the state of that civilization as a whole, is an open question. Napoleon was surely one of the great men of history, which doesn't mean he was a nice guy. And I suppose Joan of Arc was one of the great women. The fact that they both came to bad ends is a statement on the price of greatness. Former Emperor Napoleon died in exile on a remote island in the South Atlantic, and Joan of Arc, as I said, was burnt alive and died of smoke inhalation. Later, her remains were burnt 2 more times. I enjoyed Paris, although maybe not in the way that other people do. The famous graves, the boulangeries, the epic architecture, and the tiny steaks. On the other hand, the Eiffel Tower is just a bunch of iron bolted together. Barely worth the walk. 2 stars. That's about all I've got for today. Shortly after I wrote this article, I read somebody talking about how nobody goes to see the Eiffel Tower anymore when they visit Paris. I sort of begrudgingly visited the tower with Morena, and I would say it's somewhat overrated, but I guess all this makes me some sort of bleeding-edge hipster who's ignoring important monuments because they're not cool anymore. I don't even know. In the 22 years since I first came to Europe, Ryanair and the other low-cost airlines have made travel from country to country a lot easier and faster and cheaper. So what was cool back then is maybe not cool now that we have many millions of people traveling every year. Over on the blog, expatmadrid.com, I have a lot more travel articles from when I go places that are not in Spain. So I was recently in New York, I was in Kerala and the south of India. I've been to all kinds of places that don't make it on this podcast because with the name Spain to Go, I'm not really podcasting about literally anywhere in the world. Anyway, if you're interested in that, head over to expatmadrid.com and click on some of the links. I am also on Substack. I announced this in my previous episode, and then I realized maybe nobody actually reads Substack except for bleeding-edge hipsters and super nerds, of which I'm probably both. Anyway, Substack is a social network where very smart people publish long essays. I'm not very smart people, but I do publish essays on there. If there were a competition on Substack for being the biggest super nerd using the most obscure vocabulary, I would be very close to the bottom. But anyway, you could go to spaintogo.substack.com and subscribe there. spaintogo.substack.com. I'll still be writing on the expatmadrid.com blog, but since I'm not an expat anymore and I don't live in Madrid, that domain name is kind of bothering me in a couple of ways. So spaintogo.substack.com is where I'm doing a little bit now. This is, of course, the Spain to Go podcast, which you can listen to on any podcast platform. If you would like to donate, the donation page is still at expatmadrid.com/donate, expat www.madrid.com/donate is where you can send me a donation, anything from 10 euros on up to however much you want. I appreciate it. One of the best parts about living in Spain, incidentally, is that you're about a 2-hour flight from almost anywhere in Europe. So if you're living in Madrid or Barcelona, you've got lots of flights to most European countries. If you're living in a smaller city, you'll still have some flights probably, because there's lots of people from lots of countries who go on holiday in Malaga. So that's one of the many reasons to love Spain. We are close to a lot of other interesting places that you can visit if you have a long weekend or something similar to that. Head over to my YouTube channel, Learn Spanish with Daniel, if you would like to learn some Spanish with me, Daniel. Learn Spanish with Daniel. Just put that into the YouTube search box. You'll find it. The other day I did a video about different ways to say that I don't care at all. So there's all these expressions. Me importa un pepino. Me importa un bledo. And other much more profane versions of those. That's on the YouTube channel, Learn Spanish with Daniel. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Please like and subscribe to this podcast. Send me a message if there's something you would like to hear about in a future episode. Thank you once again to our supporters, Ed and JR, and try to stay cool out there. Hasta la próxima. Bye.